Great. Okay, everybody hear me okay? Well, welcome everybody. Good evening and thanks for joining us. Tonight's event will explore the feasibility of advanced nuclear power in West Virginia with a particular emphasis on using this technology to repower coal plants in the state. This is an informational session, so it's not an advocacy event. We look at this as a chance to learn more and discuss the pros and cons of deploying advanced nuclear energy in the Mountain State. While the state of West Virginia has a ban on the construction of nuclear power plants, state legislatures may be moving to lift this decades-old ban, similar to our neighboring state, Kentucky. Meanwhile, at the national level, Senator Manchin has introduced bipartisan legislation to support the commercial deployment of advanced nuclear reactors. And although efforts to battle climate change have been largely dominated by renewables, the International Energy Agency says achieving a net zero greenhouse gas emission by 2050 will require doubling nuclear power worldwide. At the same time, nuclear power has some major disadvantages. It's expensive. There are unresolved questions around nuclear waste, safety, and security considerations, also new technologies, and the slow pace of building out advanced nuclear power to meet carbon reduction goals. And tonight, we'll be able to dive into these issues. We'll hear from 2 expert panelists, 3 state legislators, and most importantly, we hope to hear from you during the question and answer portion of the event. So for our first panelist is Jessica Lovering. Jessica is a founder of the Good Energy Collective, which is a policy research organization dedicated to building the progressive case for nuclear energy as a central part of the broader climate change agenda. Jessica has a doctorate from Carnegie Mellon University in engineering and public policy and is an expert in advanced nuclear technologies and nuclear economics. Most importantly, more recently, I would say, Jessica was the co-author of a policy report exploring where small modular reactor technology could support environmental justice communities that rely on coal. Jessica, I will turn it over to you for the next 20 minutes, and then I will introduce our next panelist, Jim Coatson. So Jessica, if you want to start us off and take us away and let me know if you have any questions.
Yeah, thank you, Ted, for the introduction. I'm going to share my screen. Does that look good to everyone?
Yep, that looks great.
Okay, welcome. So I am going to be talking a little bit about what we see as opportunities for coal repowering with advanced nuclear. And Ted did give a nice introduction to my organization, Good Energy Collective. But I did want to add one thing that might be relevant for today's discussion is that we are a think tank, we do research, and we are funded entirely from philanthropy. So the key point here is that we do not take any industry money, either nuclear industry, fossil fuel industry. And so I'm, purely here in an educational capacity. We look at a lot of the challenges around nuclear, particularly environmental justice issues and legacy issues with nuclear mining and waste. But we're also very interested in the opportunities that nuclear power poses for clean energy, for economic development, and so forth. So hopefully we'll be able to answer any questions you have at the end, and also share a balanced presentation of the opportunities and challenges for nuclear. So to get started, I did want to say, why nuclear? And particularly, why am I focused on nuclear? Why do we think it's a really interesting energy technology to work on amongst all the other options? So all of the nuclear in the US that's operating today, all but one plant, was built in the 60s and 70s in the US. And the reasons that nuclear was built at that time are somewhat different than the reasons we're interested in nuclear today, although not entirely different. So one of the big reasons that utilities were building nuclear in the past was energy security. So uranium fuel is extremely energy dense. And so even if you have to import uranium fuel, you can power a very large population with a small amount of fuel for several years. And so that's why places like the United Kingdom and Japan built out big nuclear fleets, because they're very dense and produce a lot of electricity for decades. Nuclear is also low cost. And I know that particularly today, we think of nuclear as having these problems with going over budget and cost overruns. And even projects in the past had those sorts of problems. And it's true that the upfront cost of nuclear to construct the plant is expensive today. It was expensive in the past, but because nuclear power plants produce so much electricity over so many years, the actual cost of generating that electricity is quite low. And that remains true today. And then the big one, and why you're starting to see more environmental organizations get interested in nuclear today, but this was also true in the 1970s, is that when a nuclear power plant is operating, it produces no local air or water pollution. So when we started having the Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, nuclear became more of an attractive option, especially for public health impacts, things like acid rain. Today, reasons are a little bit different, although energy security and low cost are still drivers, and that's why we see over 30 countries around the world are looking to start commercial nuclear programs. Similar to those same reasons when they have rapidly industrializing economies. But why people like myself and other environmental organizations are interested in nuclear is the big one is it has zero greenhouse gas emissions during operation and very low life cycle emissions. So even if you take into account all the concrete and steel that's used to build the plant, the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions are similar to solar and wind power plants. Another big appealing quality of nuclear is that it's baseload power. So it produces electricity 24/7 every day of the year. A lot of the nuclear power plants in the US, which are some of the best operating or best performing plants in the world, produce electricity about 95% of the time. That includes refueling outages. So it's really reliable power, and it can be used to balance the grid, which is becoming an increasing sort of constraint as we have more growing share of renewables, which are intermittent, through days or weeks. And you can see this sort of thing when we have really cold spells, like in the Northeast last week. You really need that on-demand electricity to support your grid. Some other aspects of nuclear that are interesting to different countries and maybe not as talked about as much is nuclear is a really small land footprint. So it takes up very little space. If you've ever visited a nuclear power plant, it's a few football fields and it produces electricity for millions of people. It also has low material requirements, which again, you may not necessarily realize when you're looking at a nuclear power plant because there's so much concrete and steel that you see and so much construction that went into it. But because the fuel is so dense, because it produces so much electricity, gigawatts at a single plant, over the life cycle, very low material requirements. There's some other uses of nuclear that have been done historically and that people are more interested in going forward as we look to a more diversified energy system, a more energy secure system. So a couple of those that I'll flag for you are industrial process heat. So there's a lot of industries that need high heat for various applications, and it's hard to get that without fossil fuels. Also desalination, countries or even regions that are pressed for water consumption, and then alternative fuels production like hydrogen production could also be done with the waste heat from nuclear energy. And this group, this nice picture that's up in the corner, these women are the founders of a group called Mothers for Nuclear, and they are just that. They are promoting nuclear power, and they kind of represent these newer groups that are interested in nuclear for different reasons, and are promoting it as one option in sort of our tool belt of energy technologies. Okay, so the reason I'm talking to you today and recent work that we've done is there is a problem that's facing a lot of places around West Virginia and the surrounding areas, which is coal plants closed for various reasons, economic, they reach the end of their life. And These coal plant closures, really hurt local economies as the workers either move away or take jobs in different sectors that may pay less. And there's promises of new energy jobs, like renewable energy jobs in a lot of these places, but they're rarely as concentrated in the communities where the coal plant was, and they don't always offer the same sorts of competitive salaries and opportunities to join a union. So something we're looking at is, if you're thinking about what does a progressive energy system look like going forward, it really needs to include and uplift all frontline communities, but that includes coal closure communities that are struggling economically from the closure of these plants and the associated mines that often go with them. And that gets us to this term that we've seen a lot from the Biden-Harris administration, which is just transition. And depends on who you talk to, you might not associate that with coal communities, but we think it's a really important consideration. So what this term means to us is that we want to make sure that fossil fuel workers have real opportunities, not just promises, but to find high quality, well-paid work in new energy jobs. And there have been a lot of promises around new energy jobs, and some of the challenges of that for former coal workers or for coal closure communities is that there's often a mismatch in job location. The jobs might not be in the same place. They might be more distributed. Mismatch in skills or required training, often reduced pay, benefits, ability to join a union. And one of the challenges is there's sort of a piecemeal state and federal approaches to helping these communities diversify economically when sourcing new energy jobs. So that's something we were interested in looking at more and seeing if advanced nuclear could be an option. So one option for some of these coal closure communities, not all, it's not a silver bullet, is could have the local deployment of advanced nuclear energy. Specifically, we're talking about small modular reactors. And I'm going to explain what these things are in the next slide. So why these might be attractive is they can offer similar pay or higher pay, similar levels of employment, and similar tax revenue to retiring coal plants. And they can also make use of a lot of the existing infrastructure, but at the same time, reducing a lot of public health impacts from the coal combustion and mining. So it looks like it could be a really good option for some communities. Okay, so the title of this panel, and I've used the phrase advanced nuclear, and some of you may know what that is, but a lot of you maybe don't. So I'm going to give a one-slide primer and then explain some of the most interesting projects that are moving forward right now. So really, this term advanced nuclear is quite a big umbrella term, and it means anything that's different from the nuclear power plants that we have operating around the country today. A lot of them use different fuels, different coolants, different structures and geometries. Something that's pretty common across the different designs is that they're usually smaller, whether in total size or in the unit size. They're often modular, so that can mean many different things. Either the whole thing is modular or modular components they're constructed on site. And they often have passive safety. And so what that means is that it's a big shift in how we manage safety at a nuclear power plant, moving from engineered safety systems to intrinsic or passive safety systems that rely on laws of physics instead of engineered systems. And there's lots of different things that are encompassed in that, but I did want to give one example because it's one that my mom really likes when I explain passive safety, and that's to think about convective cooling, like in a soup pot or your tea kettle. And that is when we turn off the fire, when we shut down the nuclear reactions in the core, the coolant keeps cooling using convection. So the hot water rises, and cools, and then as it cools, it drops down, and these convective cycles go. And a lot of advanced nuclear designs are designed in a way that incorporates convective cooling in case the reactor gets too hot. They shut down on their own, and then they use convective cooling instead of forced circulation of cooling fluids to keep them cool and cool them down to background levels. So that's just one example. If you're interested, there's a lot more that you can read about. Modular and factory fabricated units is also a big paradigm shift in deployment. Nuclear typically has been built as huge infrastructure projects, $1 billion. Whereas we move to much smaller nuclear reactors, they could be built in a factory setting, much like natural gas turbines are done today. It's a big industry in the US. There's over 60 companies working on different advanced nuclear designs. 7 have begun working with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission in the US to license. And there is a federal program called Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program that's aiming for commercial demonstration of several designs before 2030. And I'm going to talk about 2 projects that are probably the farthest along, just to give you a sense of where the industry is. So one we like to talk about is NuScale Power, which came out of Oregon State University. They have an agreement with the Utah Associated Municipal Power Systems. So that's a collection of municipal power providers to build their first plant in Idaho, but providing power to communities across Utah and surrounding states. And this reactor looks very similar to past reactors. It's light water, so it's water cooled, but a lot of innovations in safety and construction. And the big thing is that it's going to be a modular. So it'll be built, the individual reactors, what generates energy and generates electricity, is small. It's only about 50 megawatts, but you build it in a 6-pack or a 12-pack. So the ultimate size of the power plant is going to be about 450 megawatts of electricity. It can also load follow much better than existing nuclear power plants. And they've done some great work showing how it can pair with local wind generation to balance out that intermittent source. It's going to be replacing power from a coal plant in the area that is reaching the end of its life. And so the communities that make up UAMPS are interested in replacing this electricity generation. They had this really wonderful engagement model of community opt-in, and they built in a lot of off-ramps. So if communities decided or municipal utilities decided they didn't like the project, they didn't want to be committed to it, there were spots where they could opt out. And also non-UAMPS members can participate by buying a portion of the power. All right, I think that's almost that NuScale. Another one that's been announced more recently is Terra Power. They are building a project in Wyoming. This technology looks quite different than today's existing nuclear power plants. It's a sodium fast reactor and also has energy storage incorporated. The first power they're expecting is sort of mid-2028. And what they did is they looked at communities in Wyoming that had formerly had coal power plants, and they talked with them to see who was interested. And eventually they chose one of those communities. Kemmerer was just chosen in November. And they estimate about 2,000 construction jobs and then 250 operating jobs long-term at the plant. Okay, so you've already seen that some places are considering nuclear for grids or for specific sites where coal plants are retiring. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about whether this makes sense and where this might make sense. So I'm going to be very brief today, but if you're interested in more details, Good Energy Collective just released a report called Opportunities for Coal Communities Through Nuclear Energy. And we actually go through places that have coal plants retiring in sort of the next 10 or 15 years and see which ones would be a good fit for a small modular reactor. And we go through various filtering criteria to find those plants. So you can see that at our website. But just big picture, why nuclear might be a good option for coal repowering. So some of the benefits to communities where these coal closures are occurring is that nuclear plants per unit of energy, per gigawatt, per megawatt, provide more jobs, higher salaries, and tend to have more union jobs or more opportunities to join the union for their workers. Compared to coal, but also definitely compared to renewable energy jobs. The jobs stay local if it's built at the same site or nearby, and they're also long-term. So nuclear power plants now are getting licensed to operate for 60 to 80 years. So that is some very good job security. For a lot of the workers at coal plants, pretty minimal retraining is required. Nuclear sounds complicated, and it is a very high-tech technology, but a lot of the jobs are quite similar. In the end, you're putting fuel in, you're generating heat and generating electricity. So not so much retraining needed for a lot of the positions, but I'll go into a little more detail on that, and similar level of tax revenue. There's also benefits for the companies that are developing these advanced nuclear designs. The big one is that they can make use of existing infrastructure like transmission lines, rail and roads, cooling water, so that infrastructure doesn't go to waste or have to be fully decommissioned. And then the big one for the developers is that they can take advantage of the local workforce that has very relevant experience. So this is a table comparing jobs at NuScale specifically. This is from a report they did looking at coal repowering. But I won't let you go into this. You can read the report if you're really interested. But most of the jobs don't require a bachelor's degree, but they do need vocational experience or experience working in a power plant. So these communities would have a lot of good folks for that. And also a lot of jobs that only require a high school degree. And they've done a little bit more work, and this is something that the nuclear developers will need to do more work on, especially with communities that are interested, is figuring out how to efficiently retrain people or match people with jobs that match their experience. Okay, and this is some recommendations from our report. And the big lesson for whether you're an SMR developer that's looking at coal repowering or a community that's facing a coal closure or a utility that's operating a coal plant that is going to retire in sort of the next 10 or 15 years is it's never too early to start the process. Especially if you are looking to see if this type of project would be feasible or would be a good fit for your community. There's lots of places where it's not going to be a good fit, and we really want communities to be driving this process. So to be self-selecting for where these projects might be most successful. So important to engage with the local utility, municipality, and the owners of the coal plants. Also identifying local technical community colleges and universities, and identifying, if there's a community workforce organization that already exists in the area that can help look at these plans of how much retraining is required for workers, or how to best match workers from the different types of power plants. And then, basic things like figuring out what infrastructure is there, and what opportunities are for matching that infrastructure between the coal plant and the SMR. All right, and I'm going to stop almost there. A big point that I want to leave you with is that I've been talking a lot about new nuclear technologies, and there's been lots of innovations there. But what really needs to happen, and what we would like to see, is that new nuclear technologies should come with new deployment models. So we really want to see the deployment of new nuclear driven by communities that would host such power plants, and have genuine early engagement with the communities to make sure all the stakeholders are included, and that there's good social license to operate for new nuclear plants, and just genuine buy-in and support from the host community. And so I'm going to leave that there. If you want to follow us anywhere, and I'll be around for questions later.
Great. Thank you so much, Jessica. I know that was a lot to get into one presentation, but it was very informative. Before I introduce our next panelist, I'd like to thank the co-sponsors of the event today, which includes the West Virginia Rivers Coalition, West Virginia Environmental Council, the West Virginia Climate Alliance, W Law Center for Energy and Sustainable Development, the West Virginia Office of Energy, West Virginia Manufacturers Association, West Virginia Citizen Action Group, and the Charleston branch of the NAACP, along with the Citizens Climate Lobby. Also like to call your attention to an article by native Charleston Samuel Moss that's in Black by God that Crystal Good included in the chat. So check that out too if you get a chance. So our next panelist is Jim Coatson. Jim is an associate professor of plant pathology at West Virginia University, where he has taught for 37 years. Jim has been a leader on many important environmental issues in West Virginia in the past 2 decades, and just has an enormous amount of knowledge of state policies and regulations on energy and the environment. Jim is currently the conservation and political chair of the West Virginia Sierra Club, and he's been on the executive committee of the West Virginia Sierra Club for over 25 years. Jim received his PhD from the University of Wisconsin, and we're very happy to have you, Jim. Thank you for participating today, and I'll let you take it away.
Thank you very much. I'm going to start out with a share screen, and we'll look at a quick PowerPoint. Do this right. Okay, so I've been asked to present some alternative ideas in this regard, and I'm going to start out with the question, is nuclear of any sort an appropriate solution for many of the problems that West Virginia faces? I want to start out by thanking Jessica, and I certainly support the approach of early engagement with communities, and we certainly recognize the need for addressing some of the dependencies of our coal workers and our coal communities. These have to be part of the solution. And the question as to why we're having this discussion, I think Jessica did a very good job of introducing that. The need for low carbon, reliable baseload electricity that's on demand, the hope for advanced designs that can avoid some of the potential nuclear accidents that are inherent in the traditional types of reactors, what I'm going to be calling the light water reactors. Now, the developers of many of these so-called non-light water reactors claim that they are cheaper, safer, and more efficient, and they go through a number of names: the small modular reactors, the micro reactors. The US Department of Energy defines a small modular reactor as typically in the tens up to about 300 megawatts. A full-size coal-fired power plant, such as the Fort Martin power plant in my backyard, is somewhere around 1,100 megawatts. So these are significantly smaller. There are also some opportunities for what are called micro-reactors, typically in the 1 to 5 megawatt range. Those would be useful for off-site power that are distant from the grid. They have a number of other uses that have been discussed.
Jim, this is Ted. I was going to tell you
a lot of my discussion on a report from the Union of Concerned Scientists. I have been a member of Union of Concerned Scientists for almost as long as I've been in West Virginia. And they published a report by Edwin Lyman, who is the director of nuclear power safety, in March of last year. Advanced isn't always better. Some of the key questions that we really want to be able to address is whether these new designs are actually better. Are they cheaper, safer, more secure? And that is a case that I don't believe has yet been demonstrated. Another very important question, do the benefits outweigh the risks? And finally, can these new designs be brought online fast enough to help reduce climate change? So there are a number of different technologies that are being discussed. The so-called non-light water reactors often occur as either a sodium-cooled reactor as opposed to water. There are some high-temperature gas-cooled reactors, and then there are so-called molten salt reactors. These are ones that are touted as they can't melt down because they're already in a liquid form. We'll get into some of that in a bit. In addition to these different types of reactors, there are several types of fuel. The current standard nuclear power plant uses what is called low enriched uranium. It's about 5% uranium-235. There are some of the reactors that used a higher enriched form, the high assay low enriched uranium, which is 10 to 20% of uranium-235. There's plutonium reactors from reprocessing spent fuel. There is some discussion of thorium as a fuel. And then the highly enriched uranium, which is greater than 20% U-235. This is the stuff that nuclear weapons are made of. None of the reactor technologies that are proposed for nuclear power would use the highly enriched uranium. The question is whether they still represent a potential for nuclear terrorism. There are some issues with these that Lyman points out. The first of those is that given that the chemistry of the fuel is fundamentally different from that that's used in light water reactors, will there be enough to operate them at the scales needed to replace our fossil fuel fleet? Another key issue is that there really are not the prototype models for the currently proposed designs. We have a real concern about reliability because we haven't done the long range of testing with these new technologies to verify that they will operate as predicted. As a means of example, our current light water reactors that were started in the 1960s took about 30 years before their capacity factor went from about 50% to over 90%. Capacity factor is the percentage of the time that the plant is operating at full power. And in the early years, many of these plants had to be brought offline for upgrades and repairs and operational difficulties that had not been anticipated.
Hey, Jim, this is
Pretty
Ted.
good now.
Can you hear me, Jim? Can you move it to
Ted,
full
yes.
on your slideshow? We're not seeing your slides. So can you hit slideshow full screen and then go through your slides?
Okay. Well, let's stop the sharing and see what we can do with that. I'm sorry about that.
No problem. We just want to make sure everybody sees what you're presenting.
Huh. Is that showing up?
Yes.
Okay. Go back up just a few slides. Apologize for that. Okay, so again, Jim Coatson, Conservation Chair. I mentioned some of these reactions. Jessica has already covered many of those. The source that I will be supplying is from this Union of Concerned Scientists report by Edward and Lyman. Advanced isn't always better. The key questions I went over, again, these types of fuel and types of reactors, that is kind of an important distinction. We talked briefly about the sodium fast-cooled reactor. In a light water reactor, water is the coolant that circulates around the reactor to carry that heat away. In the sodium reactor, it is actually a liquid sodium rather than water that is used to transfer the heat. There are also high temperature gas cooled reactors and the molten salt reactors. And each of these then uses slightly different types of fuel. I mentioned the low enriched uranium, less than 5% of uranium-235. Some of the reactors use a higher enriched uranium. It has the advantage that they are more energy dense, but it also creates additional risks from other problems. There's the plutonium reprocessing reactors, sometimes called breeder reactors, thorium fuels, and then the highly enriched uranium, which is the weapons grade material that is not currently used in nuclear power plant reactors. We talked briefly about the lack of prototypes and the reliability issues. The concern is that many of these new novel reactor designs solve certain safety concerns, but actually create other concerns. For example, a sodium reactor has many advantages in terms of efficiency and better fuel use, lower reactivity or radioactive material produced. But sodium is in fact a highly corrosive and highly flammable material. It is one of those things where we don't really want to see leaks. So every one of those reactors, as we'll see shortly, has some issues with those. And the one that is a current issue with existing reactors and also occurs with the new novel designs is the so-called concern about embrittlement. When we bombard steel or concrete or any of these other components with neutron radiation, it does what neutron radiation does. It changes an atom from one compound or one element to another. And that tends to lead to the steel and the aluminum and the other materials becoming more brittle over time. I'm going to refer you to Lyman's discussion of this, but this particular slide, which is probably a little bit small to read, describes several different types of reactors: the conventional burner or breeder reactor, the natrium reactor, some of these high temperature gas reactors, as well as the molten salt reactors. Several of them have some real advantages in reducing the amount of radioactive waste, those highlighted in the green or the dark blue. Oops, that went backwards. Some also are much more resource efficient. Virtually all of them, according to Lyman, still retain some significant safety issues that create greater risks than some of the existing problems or existing power plants. And the risk of nuclear proliferation or terrorism is at least as severe, if not significantly more severe, with all of these new technologies. Now, this is the point in the talk where all the liberal activists would bring out the mushroom cloud or the glow in the dark cows or some of those problems. But as a conservative, I believe that cost is the real Achilles heel. This is the one that will keep the real conservatives up at night, because to achieve these economies of scale that are touted, these factories that will in fact reduce the per unit cost would need to produce hundreds or perhaps thousands of those reactors. Unfortunately, given all the different types of technologies, there's still not really a consensus on which design we should be building the factories to produce. Another major cost issue is that while these are smaller plants, and therefore the upfront capital cost is lower, the efficiencies of scale are also lower. in many cases much lower. A pipe to carry water, as any good engineer will tell you, has a flow proportional to the fourth power of the radius. But the amount of steel or aluminum needed for that pipe is proportional to the radius. So as the pipes get smaller, the cost per unit goes up fairly dramatically. Even the best small modular proposals still cost twice as much per megawatt hour as current costs for wind and solar. The security concerns also are of great concern to me. They don't really go away just because the reactors are smaller. While there is not a potential for a nuclear explosion per se, the potential for converting something like this into a dirty bomb hijacked by terrorists is a legitimate concern. We saw that on 9/11 when terrorists flew jetliners into the World Trade Center. The same type of accident creates real nightmares for security. The costs for operating these may be much cheaper, but the decommissioning costs for a nuclear power plant are much higher than those for a conventional coal, gas, or wind or solar plant. And there is still the concern about liability insurance. Unlike other forms of power, nuclear still gets a significant taxpayer subsidy for their liability insurance. The NuScale proposal illustrates some of the real costs of small modular reactors. When it was first proposed 17 years ago, they were talking about generating power in the range of $1,700 per kilowatt. And that is a capacity factor. As you can see, over time, that cost has gone up, and in fact, it is significantly higher today. In addition to capacity, what we actually burn is not kilowatts, but kilowatt hours, or in this case, megawatt hours. A consulting firm, Lazard, is sort of the industry go-to for estimating costs of electricity. Their levelized cost of electricity for nuclear today is around $155 per megawatt hour. That's about 15 cents per kilowatt hour. The proposal that Jessica mentioned, this NuScale facility came in around $55 an hour. Wind and solar around $40 an hour. And the costs are going down for those.
About 1 minute, Jim, okay?
I'm just about finished. So this chart illustrates the current levelized cost of electricity. Nuclear is in this $130 to $200 range. Existing plants that are paid off are down here at $29, but building a new plant is much more expensive. If we want to look at a base load plant that can provide power on demand, one of the issues that I think we should be looking at is geothermal energy, here at $56 to $93 an hour. So my conclusions, we need a lot more research. We really have a problem with the issue of whether it can be developed fast enough. We have a problem with the waste repositories that are still not under construction. The photo illustrates the current dry cask storage that's occurring at existing power plants. That is certainly not a long-term solution. I agree, we need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions very quickly. And every year that we delay that increases the costs, the risks to our environment, and to the disruptions in remaining years. The recommendation I have is that we should pursue the cleanest, quickest, safest, and cheapest options first, and nuclear comes last in every area. And as a transition to our next speakers, West Virginia has what has been touted as a nuclear power ban, which is in Chapter 34, Article 27A, Section 2, which is not really a ban, in my opinion. It is some conditions on power plant siting. And in order to site a power plant in West Virginia, we need to demonstrate that there is permanent waste disposal for the radioactive waste, that it's economically feasible for ratepayers, and that it complies with our existing environmental standards. And I'm going to argue that those are reasonable and rational positions that we should take, and we should not get rid of those conditions. So thank you very much, and I appreciate the chance, and we'll answer some questions later on.
Great. Thank you so much, Jim. Very informative as always. So I'm going to turn it over to Morgan with West Virginia Rivers Coalition to introduce our next speakers. Take it away, Morgan.
Thanks so much, Ted. I'm very happy to introduce 3 members of the West Virginia House of Delegates that have joined us this evening to discuss the political landscape around this topic and also upcoming legislation that's expected during this legislative session. But before I hand it over to them, I want to quickly flag to make sure you keep adding your questions into the Q&A box to the bottom left of the screen, and that if we run over a few minutes, we can keep answering your questions. So don't worry about that; they will get answered. So now I'm happy to hand it over to delegates Kayla Young, Evan Hansen, and Brandon Steele.
Do you have a particular order you'd like us to go in?
Whatever works best for you all.
Okay. Well, I could start and talk for a couple minutes. I want to thank Dr. Lovering and Dr. Coatson. You've given us all a lot to think about. I feel like at the legislature, there's 2 really important things that we need to do that we'll be judged on 10, 20 years in the future. One of those is how we address climate change, which is a particularly tricky issue to address in West Virginia. And the other is how we revitalize coal communities. So I just want to say a word about both those things before talking about the bills. In terms of climate change, I've spent a lot of effort over the last few years trying to deal with that to make sure we could diversify our energy mix in West Virginia, specifically put a lot of effort into making sure we could allow as much solar as possible to reduce emissions and create jobs. And I'm going to keep doing that because there's a lot more that we need to do. But I think at the same time, we need to consider all different types of carbon-free electricity, including geothermal and hydro at existing dams. But also, I think we need to consider nuclear. And I think also to help set the stage is to think about what's going on in our coal and power plant communities across the state. The speaker and the minority leader created this work group called the Coal Communities Work Group at the end of last session. I'm a member of that work group, and it essentially recognizes that there's an urgent need to diversify coal community economies. And among the things we did was a series of listening sessions at 5 different coal communities. I was at 4 of those 5 and reviewed all the notes from all 5. And people are very open to new ideas. I think we're at a moment right now where people are really open, more open than they have been in the past. So I think we as legislators, we owe it to people in the communities that are most impacted by the decline of coal production and the potential closure of coal-fired power plants to consider all options. So that's the lens that I'm looking at this through. So in terms of bills, I know that there's a straight repeal bill, and I'm frankly less interested in that bill. I'm more interested in a bill that puts the repeal of the power plant ban in the context of how do we repurpose coal-fired power plant sites if and when they close. There is a bill that has been introduced. It doesn't have a number yet, but all 3 of us delegates that are on this call tonight are co-sponsors of the bill. And it does 3 things. The first thing it does is it provides some language to the Public Service Commission regarding repurposing power plant sites if and when coal plants close. The goal is to protect ratepayers and to choose an energy source that doesn't result in increases in electric rates. The second thing it does is it allows electric utilities to refinance the capital balance on their coal-fired power plants. Again, to save ratepayers money. It's using something called securitization, but it's essentially refinancing debt when you close a power plant and you haven't paid off all your debt yet. And the third thing it does within that context is address the nuclear ban or the restrictions on nuclear so that nuclear can at least be considered as an option when a coal plant is being retired. And I guess I would close by saying that even if this bill passes and even if federal money comes into the state to build a nuclear plant on a coal-fired power plant site, we're not going to see a plant operational in West Virginia for a long time, probably a decade or something like that. So I still think there's an urgent need to move full speed ahead to build out as many renewables as possible to reduce emissions and to create jobs. So that's where I'm coming from on this. And then I'm not sure who's next. Looks like both Chairman Steele and Delegate Young are both on now.
Kayla, do you want to talk now, and then we'll let Brandon?
Sure, I'm happy to. Thanks, Evan, and thanks to everybody for being here. And thanks to the presenters for putting on two sides of the issue. And I'm really excited about this. I signed on to Delegate Steele's bill, which is a straight nuclear repeal, last year because I want to have all of the above options when we're considering new energy sources in West Virginia. We know we have to make a transition and we know we have to decarbonize, and I want there to be all hands on deck. When I signed on to the bill originally, I didn't know that much about nuclear, and I've spent the last year working with Senator Manchin and with Evan and with different power companies, talking to them and learning so much about nuclear energy. And the more I learn about it, the more excited I am. I'm really interested in, as Jessica was talking about, the non-electric appliance uses also. I had a letter submitted to the United States Senate Natural Resource Committee that Chairman Manchin runs about different uses for nuclear energy. It's not just power plants. There's so many different options. I'm really excited about the Department of Defense capabilities to utilize nuclear around the world, and some of those demonstrations that they're doing that we could be doing here in West Virginia. So I'm interested in whatever gets us to decarbonize. And I think nuclear absolutely has to be a part of that mix. I've been reading through the questions. I think there's a lot of questions. I also think we don't have all the answers. But I'm glad that everybody's here and that we're learning, and I'm just excited. So thank you, guys.
Great, thank you, Delegate Young. Delegate Steele, would you like to talk about the bill and moving forward?
Sure, thanks, Ted. It's good to be on with you guys. I'm Delegate Steele out of Raleigh County. I'm chairman of House Government Organization. I introduced this bill last year. I'm pretty sure myself and Delegate Foster were the only people on the bill initially. It was, a lot of times you'll introduce a bill just to kind of introduce a topic, which is what I was really doing with that bill. I was under no impression that bill would progress and become law last year. I really just wanted to start the conversation just to see, how people felt about it, because it's something that we haven't discussed in close to 40 years since the ban was put into place. The world's changed since then. West Virginia back then probably had over 3,000 active coal mines. We're down to 93. That's 93, as less than 100. We're the number 5 energy producer in the nation per state. And we have no nuclear, no natural gas. We're all coal, hydro, a little bit of solar, a little bit of wind, and we're still the number 5 energy producer. And I thought it was time to revisit this. No particular motivation other than we need to understand why we're prohibiting an activity. Even if we've prohibited it for a very long time, we need to understand why we're prohibiting it. As I investigated it more, as Kayla mentioned, Delegate Young mentioned when she was speaking, it wasn't until I introduced the bill that I started learning a lot more about it. And I've heard arguments like, been presented at first and then second from the gentleman from WVU of the whys and why nots of what you're doing. And what I noticed was it's not a necessarily the arguments against aren't necessarily we can't have it all together, but we need to understand why we're doing what we're doing. And that's when I discovered that there was actually a lot of broad support for exploring this idea. So we talked about a lot of things today and heard a lot of things. We're grateful for everyone that's contributed their expertise. I feel very strongly about presenting the question as a yes or no. You know, are we going to do a repeal or are we not going to do a repeal? Because there's a million other questions that have to be answered after that. If the answer to that question is yes, then we need to take the gentleman from WVU at face value and investigate every last one of those concerns. On the other end, we need to take the other side at face value and say, there's a potential great impact here. And one of the things that I look at with this, and I think Delegate Hansen would probably tell you from some of the floor fights we've had on various coal issues, that I'm probably one of the strongest coal proponents you're going to find in the legislature. You know, I represent, southwestern Raleigh County, which is probably one of the strongest coal communities in the history of the world. I represent Tams Mountain, which is known as the Great Smokeless Coal Seam. It's the purest coal you'll find on Earth. It burns so hot there is no smoke, and we're very proud of that. It's something that, you know, going back to my great-great-grandfather, everybody but me's worked in the coal mines. And, my dad was a member of the UMWA. And that's something that we're all proud of, and it's all part of our heritage. But I'll say this, and this is something that I've told, a lot of people that are probably listening to this phone call. I am not married to the mineral. I'm married to the miner. That's what I'm in office for, is to look out for West Virginians that are trying to go out and freely live their life as an American and earn a decent living. And due to circumstances beyond our control, we're in a position where we need to begin to investigate alternatives. If it was up to West Virginia, the world would burn coal 90% of the time. There's no doubt about that. But we have to realize that we're in a world that's changing. West Virginia is not going to be the place that convinces the world to not do what the majority of the world wants to do. And we have to adapt, to improvise, and overcome. And that's what that bill's all about. And exploring options, looking at different ways of doing what we're doing, and maintaining what the United States needs us to be. And if you look at West Virginia, we are an energy producer. That's what we do. And it's one of the things we do better than anybody else. And while I understand a lot of the concerns are not relevant to me to the question of, do we have a ban or not? And if the question is on whether we have a ban, I think by and large, everybody on this call would say there are circumstances in West Virginia in which it's reasonable to believe that we should lift this ban and at least talk about the topic. We talked about communities determining for themselves whether or not, a nuclear type of power plant would be there. I think that's important. If one's coming to Raleigh County, I would expect the county commission to have a say in that. I would expect citizens to have a say in that of is this going to be in your community? I think the issue of spent nuclear fuel is important. If you're going to burn nuclear fuel, we need to know what we're going to do with it once we're done with it. And those are issues that we need to talk about. But none of those questions can we talk about if there's a ban. If there's a ban, there's nothing to talk about. So to me, I think the first question that we need to answer this year is, will we keep the ban or will we get rid of it? And I think I'm very excited to be in the position we're in, to be in a position of exploring new avenues in what we do best, and that's producing energy. We do it better than anybody in the world, and I'm proud of everybody that's involved in that industry, whether it's our our companies, our power companies, our manufacturers, our, anybody involved, the workers, the unions involved, and so forth. But all of these questions and all these things that have been brought up can't really be answered if there's a ban in place. So I'm a proponent of lifting that ban and exploring over the next session or two, how do we shape this? How do we develop it and do it carefully? And that's something that if you look at West Virginia, and what I would say to the folks on the call, the concerns that were raised about, terrorism, nuclear proliferation, 9/11, we're talking about a state that has been on the forefront of producing energy in America for well over 100 years. We do it better than anybody around. The world looks at West Virginia and the mining research that we do on how to mine where they're at. Japanese folks, Germans, Russians, they look at the research we've done going back to the 60s on how to operate coal mines, and they learn from us on how to do it. Eastern Kentucky and Southern West Virginia know best of how to do that and how to safely produce energy. And I think the regulatory atmosphere that we already have set up for energy regulation through the Public Service Commission, which I would add is not elected, nonpartisan, and they make tough decisions every day. And we're pretty unique in that. Not every state has that. And, a lot of the concerns that folks have, I think if they look at the rest of the apparatus that we have in place, they'll see it's okay for us to explore this. And that's what I want to get across to everybody is we can't even have this conversation if we don't repeal the ban. Once we repeal the ban, you have to trust that, believe it or not, West Virginians are much more careful than you would think. We've been very careful about how we do this, whether it be through coal fire, through solar, or whatever. And I want to say, I agree with Kayla and Evan. I'm all of the above and all of the below. I am neutral on how we get power. What I'm not neutral on is foreclosing the discussion. And that, I think, is what this bill is all about, is we have in the United States, production of nuclear energy, depending on what you read, and I've read a lot about it, somewhere between 20 and 30% of the grid, depending on where you're at, is nuclear power. Well, in West Virginia, it's zero, and we're still the number 5 energy producer in the country. With natural gas, West Virginia is 0%. We're still the number 5 energy producer in the country. So these are questions that we need to answer. And I think we owe it to the tens of thousands of miners over the last 30 years that have lost their job to investigate this, to go down this road so that future generations don't run into what they ran into. And we owe it to our constituents. We owe it to the industries. We owe it to the people that are counting on us. And we owe it to the United States of America because they count on us to get this right. Because we are, as far as, at least the Northeast and the PJM, we're a significant contributor. And as coal falls in favor, nationally, we have got to be prepared to do something. And that's what this bill represents to me. So I feel very strongly about it. I feel very hopeful about it. And I think a lot of the concerns that we've discussed today are something that we can address. We can address logically and rationally if we can get past this one hurdle. So thank you guys for having me on today, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Delegate Steele and Delegate Young and Delegate Hansen. That was very informative, and your presence here is so noted. And we just thank you for taking time. I know you're all busy at the legislature, so we really appreciate it. And next we'll have Professor Jamie Van Nostrand, who's at the West Virginia University College of Law and serves as Director of the Center for Energy and Sustainable Development, to lead us in some questions and answering.
Thanks a lot,
answers.
Ted. Thanks a lot, Ted. Thanks a lot for all the great questions. Everybody is posted in the Q&A box and in the chat. It seems like we got a bunch of themes. I wanted to give Jessica a chance maybe to address some of the issues that were raised by Dr. Coatson. The issues can be grouped into four, I would say. One is, the cost. How does nuclear compare with other sources? Timing, can we scale up nuclear quick enough in order to achieve the greenhouse gas reductions necessary, the 45% reduction, 50% reduction by 2030 and net zero by 2050? Lots of questions about the waste disposal issue. How do the SMRs compare into our existing reactors in terms of addressing that waste disposal? Is there a long-term waste disposal question? Is that resolved? And then are the SMRs safer than the existing reactors? So when Jessica, if you just get a chance to maybe address some of those, give your thoughts on some of those group of issues.
Yeah, that's a lot of questions, but those are common concerns that I hear a lot, and they don't always have easy answers, but I'll do my best. I think on waste, it's true the US does not have a final solution for spent nuclear fuel. That's the fuel that's left after it's used up in the reactor. Other countries do, notably the big nuclear countries like France, Japan, Sweden, Finland. Most other countries recycle their fuel at least once. Fuel can be recycled a lot more. It just costs more to do that recycling. But there's definitely countries moving forward on a central repository for waste or spent fuel. In the US, it's been in political gridlock for decades, but it's not a technical problem. And these advanced reactors will have similar challenges. We'll need something to do with the final fuel. But there are ways to burn the fuel more efficiently so we get more energy out, and also recycle the fuel. So again, we get more energy out of the fuel and less volume of waste to store. But part of the reason that we don't have a solution on nuclear waste is that it is quite a manageable problem, and that the amount of spent fuel around the country is very small volume wise. It could all fit on a football field if we put it in one place, and it's very stable. It's sitting in these concrete casks. But I definitely agree, we need to move forward on a repository, on a solution for nuclear waste, and it's going to take some political willpower at the federal level to get that process moving again. But there is a process called consent-based siting that's hopefully restarting soon, about picking several locations maybe to store interim.
On the cost issue, we had a couple of points. The levelized cost of electricity. I don't know if that number that Dr. Coatson showed, if that reflects the SMR reactors, or does that reflect the stuff that's going on in Georgia? We're trying to build the Vogel and some that are large scale.
Yeah, that
plants.
reflects more of the large scale, and Lazard, has his numbers that he picks, and you can argue of these. I definitely think we're going to need to demonstrate that these are not just technically viable, but commercially viable. One thing that's promising is a lot of these developers are planning to sell on a turnkey basis. So it won't be cost plus. You'll basically know what you're paying for a project ahead of time, and you won't pay more, which is how a lot of other projects are built, like renewable energy projects. So if it is more expensive, it's the developer's burden, or the person building the reactor, not the community or the utility that's playing it. Again, it's going to be different for every company, but you definitely want to, communities need to do their due diligence on cost. But there's a lot of reasons why factory fabrication brings costs down. That's what we've seen for gas turbines, for solar technology and wind and batteries. Once you start mass producing these, or factory fabricating these, costs come down. And so that's what balances out economies of scale, which you might lose for smaller technologies, with is economies of multiples, or economies of volume. Trying to think of other questions that I saw in the comments. Really great questions from everyone.
Another one on the timing, in terms of the need to urgently reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Can we scale up these SMRs? When you look at the track record history of nuclear plants always falling way behind schedule and costing a lot more than anyone ever thought, can we actually feasibly scale up these SMRs fast enough to produce meaningful greenhouse gas reductions?
Yeah, again, that's the hope of factory fabrication. We've never built nuclear that way. We've done it as large infrastructure projects, which take a long time. Any kind of large infrastructure project in the US takes a long time to build. Things like transmission lines. And you saw those timelines, these advanced nuclear won't be ready until the end of this decade. But we also are starting to come up against constraints on scalable and other energy technologies like wind and solar because of their intermittency and the lack of grid scale storage to balance them. So we need everything, really. We need fossil fuels with carbon capture. We're going to need grid scale storage. We're going to need more nuclear. We're going to need this big scale up of renewables. We're going to need everything. And so costs need to come down for everything. But it's also a question of diversifying the energy source. Different options are going to be the best fit for different places. And I think that kind of helps people. When you have more options available, it's easier and faster.
In terms of the decommissioning, do SMRs present the same sort of challenges in terms of hundreds of millions of dollars that have to be put in a decommissioning fund, or so
that's going to be up to the regulator, NRC. Right now, regulation requires that owners of nuclear power plants set aside funds for decommissioning. Some of the modular reactor developers are looking at taking back the reactor. So rather than decommission it at site, it will be taken back and decommissioned at a central facility. That could bring down costs because, again, it's the economies of scale of processing that material. But again, these are some of the questions that are going to be worked out as these go through licensing. And that's the due diligence that'll be done by the regulator. You shouldn't definitely trust any company at its word for energy technology, but make sure the regulatory process is fair and transparent.
In terms of subsidies, I think Gary Zuckett mentioned existing nuclear plants get this liability coverage right under the Price-Anderson Act because no insurer is going to take on that kind of risk. Does that still apply with SMRs?
So all nuclear power plant owners are required to buy private insurance for liability up to the maximum that they can. What Price-Anderson does is if there's an extreme circumstance like an accident, then it requires the nuclear industry as a whole. So everyone that owns a plant pitches into this fund. So again, it's still funded by the owners of nuclear power plants. Only once you get above a very high level of impacts does the federal government have the option to add additional funds, and that would be tax refund. So Price-Anderson is a little more complicated than people think, but they are nuclear power plants are required to buy private insurance for liability up to the maximum that they can. And because the safety case is so much greater for these advanced reactors, because they can't melt down in a lot of cases, they can't have offsite releases of radioactive material. Again, this needs to be proven sufficiently to the regulator before they'll be built. And that's what companies are doing now. But hopefully that will also translate into much lower liability and burden for the owners.
In terms of environmental justice, I mean, part of the Good Energy Collective report talks about the just transition. How can we be sure that the environmental justice track record with respect to where nuclear plants are located and where the uranium is mined is going to have a better outcome than what we've experienced with coal communities?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's nuclear is different and interesting and definitely has a complicated legacy. Right now, nuclear power plants in the US tend to be built in wealthier, whiter suburban places. So it looks different than where fossil fuel plants are located. But the fuel cycle facilities, so where uranium was mined and where fuel was fabricated, does tend to be in more of these environmental justice communities. Historically, now the US does not produce their own fuel now. We import it from places like Canada and Australia. Regulation and practices are much better now. So I'd say we want to make sure we have good regulations in place to oversee these, and especially when we're importing fuel from other places, that's an open question. And this is not unique to nuclear. You've seen this in a lot of renewable energy, batteries, these critical resources, a lot of which come from places like China that don't have such good standards. So even when we're importing supplies, we don't want to just be exporting the problem somewhere else. We want to make sure that there's good regulations on human rights, on safety, even when we're getting materials from other places. And that's true for nuclear, and that's true for renewables and batteries as well.
Sorry, Dr. Coatson, do you have anything you wanted to add now that Jessica's had a chance to maybe comment on your critique of nuclear? Do you have anything you would offer in response to what Jessica said?
Well, thank you. I do agree with many of the things that Jessica has said. I think my main point with regard to what our legislators are talking about, the so-called ban on nuclear power basically requires three things: that a nuclear power plant application complies with existing environmental rules, is cost effective for our West Virginia ratepayers, and that there is a permanent repository for nuclear waste. The policy choice that our legislature has to deal with is whether we should go ahead without having satisfied those three conditions.
On that cost, how do you determine what the cost is if you can't put a price on the nuclear waste disposal? I mean, determine whether it's cost effective. You want to be able to do an all-in cost. And how do you come up with that number to compare the cost against other resources? Any thoughts on that?
So nuclear waste is currently priced into operating costs. Everyone who operates or owns a nuclear power plant does pay into this federal nuclear waste fund. It's a price that's tacked on to ratepayers' bills. It's quite small in comparison, again, because nuclear produces so much electricity over the lifetime of the plant, and the volume of the waste is so small. But it's already factored in. But yeah, again, and it's a similar question for renewables. You know, what happens at the end of life for a wind turbine? We don't have that priced into levelized cost. I'm not saying, again, when I bring up these things, I'm not saying we shouldn't do renewables. I think we need to do a lot more renewables, but we need to look at the challenges of these technologies on a more equal footing.
So how about our legislators, Kayla and Evan and Brandon? Any follow-up questions of either Jessica or Jim? Kayla says no. Evan? Brandon?
I don't have any specific questions.
No,
I guess,
this is, oh, sorry.
okay, it's okay. Go ahead, Brandon.
No, Evan, the only thing I was going to say is I didn't have any questions, and I just thank everybody for being here and talking about it.
So, Evan, would the bill that's being rolled out, does it still incorporate the three criteria that Dr. Coatson has rolled out in terms of having a waste disposal solution? It has to be cost effective. Would you say it still incorporates those criteria?
The one criteria that I think it does incorporate is the cost effectiveness. The portion of the bill that provides some criteria for the Public Service Commission to consider when you're repurposing the coal-fired power plant site talks about cost effectiveness and impacts on ratepayers. So, you know, just because the ban is lifted doesn't mean necessarily that nuclear would compete and win on one of these coal-fired power plant sites. It could be that 5 or 10 years from now, solar plus storage clearly outcompetes it, and then that would be the preference. So it's really sort of neutral on the fuel, but it just sets out some factors for the commission to consider.
Yeah, we've had a lot of questions and comments in the chat about sort of other energy options that we have in West Virginia. You know, lots of hydro out there to the extent you can retrofit existing dam and locks. The cost effectiveness of renewables. It seemed like that's and some references to geothermal, because we obviously have geothermal resources available in West Virginia. So it seems like as long as you have that cost effectiveness test, and nuclear would have to be shown to be cost effective alongside those other options. That's how those other potential sources would get factored into it if if the legislation gets passed in its current form. Is that fair to say, Evan?
I think that's true. But let me say a word about geothermal. We had a WVU researcher from the Energy Institute scheduled to present at the Energy Committee interim meeting last week, but that got canceled due to the special session. But WVU is starting up a research project where they're actually digging test wells. And we've known from some research that's been done previously that West Virginia sits on a geothermal hotspot. But what's not been known is how hot is it, and is it really sufficient to generate electricity? And so this research project is going to help us start to get some real answers to that question. I think the hypotheses, or the current state of knowledge, is that it may not be quite hot enough to actually build power plants. It may be hot enough for some other types of applications, like for steam generation or heating and things like that. But you need even more heat to build a power plant. So I think we'll know more in a few months to a couple of years, but it's not necessarily quite as rosy a picture as a lot of people think it might be.
Some of you may be aware, some of that early research that was done at WVU was done by West Virginia's own Brian Anderson, who was heading up the Energy Institute at the time and is now heading up that interagency task force for addressing the needs of coal-dependent communities. He actually guest lectured in my class a few times on the geothermal. And I think you're right, it's not hot enough to generate electricity, but it's hot enough that it gives you a head start on some kind of a district energy heating system that would serve the WVU campus. Jim, got anything to add, Mr. Coatson?
Yes, I think Delegate Hansen is correct. The issue is it hot enough to generate steam that can turn a turbine with our current technologies? Where that is cost effective have been places like California and Hawaii, where there are volcanic hot springs and so on, where they can get those superheated steam. There is certainly enough hot water in that area that it could provide area heat and industrial sources of heat. Electricity generation may take some additional types of technologies, and it may take some specialized locations, but it is certainly something that would take advantage of West Virginia's current expertise in deep drilling technology, and the gas industry will tell you that they can do this. I think it is definitely something that is worth exploring, and we really need to be looking at this as one of the real opportunities.
One last question for Jessica. Karen May is looking at that that NuScale project that UAMPS is doing. I think is pointed out, I think maybe Coatson had that in one of his slides. It looks like we're kind of going down the same path where it's going to be a lot cheaper and the cost figures keep going up. I mean, don't we have the same concerns with SMRs that it's just going to, we really don't know what the costs are going to be, and how do we address those concerns?
Yeah, I mean, this is my point about we need to do commercial demonstrations to really prove the costs. And we would expect costs to come down with successive builds with the factory fabrication. But again, I don't want anyone to take it at face value or assume that's the case. And I would hope that communities that are interested or utilities that are interested in buying these plants, not just do their due diligence, but also if you can commit to a contract that's a fixed price, so you as the purchaser of a reactor don't bear any cost overruns. I think is a model that we're going to see a lot more of going forward with nuclear, because there is this history of cost overruns with these large power plants.
It is a good point. Put that shift of cost overrun, shift that risk onto the developers rather than the poor ratepayers, because we don't need that in West Virginia. That's for sure. Ted, anything else before we wrap this up?
Yeah, I just want to thank everybody. This has been a very productive conversation, and the guests we've had. I think I've learned a lot through this discussion through everybody, and there's a lot more to dive into. And I know this is going to be a hot topic at the legislative session. I just really appreciate Jamie and everybody being involved in this, and everybody who got the word out about the event. And this is probably just the beginning of this discussion. And please feel free to contact myself at the Ohio River Valley Institute or Morgan King at the West Virginia Rivers Coalition for any additional information. Hopefully we'll have this recorded too, and we'll send out a link to that. If you register, you'll get a link to the recording as well.
Thank you for having us.
Okay, thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Appreciate you very much.
Everyone.
Thanks, Morgan.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Jen.
Thank you both.